So hello, everyone. Sorry for being a bit late, but we had some technical issues here, but I think we're all set up now. Thank you, everyone on site and online who are attending the International Lecture Series. Today we have Wojciech Kębłowski, an assistant professor from Vrije Universiteit Brussel, and he will be presenting about what does it mean to be critical about transport. He will explore some of the key issues that are related to this topic. So we have 2 hours at our hands, roughly. So we can use some more time at the end for discussions and questions and answers. So without further ado, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me well, both in the room and in the virtual community of transport scholars who, on a Wednesday afternoon, follow us from Vrije University. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm really honored to be invited for this lecture series. The names of other colleagues that I'm joining are really, well, a sign of great privilege and great honor to be invited. Thank you, Georgi, for organizing everything so that I could be here in time, in good spirit. I hope the technical issues are now solved. I hope you can see the slide, not my notes. Not that there is any secrets there, but still, I don't want to spoil the surprises about what I'll be talking about. So indeed, the point of today's presentation lecture is to discuss a little bit about what it could or what it means to be critical about transport and mobility. What does it mean for us transport researchers, for policymakers, for activists, also for users, passengers, drivers at times. If we have an individual motorized vehicle, it should not perhaps be a source of shame, but it happens sometimes that we drive. What does it mean to be critical as actors within the domain of transport and mobility? I'll try to discuss this. I don't know how much time I'll take. I haven't timed this presentation very strictly, but I understand that time is not necessarily a constraint. I very much hope to get some questions and discussion after the presentation, so I hope that we have enough time for that. So once again, thank you very much, and off we go. I don't think it's very difficult to note today, as it was not difficult, there's some echo, 5 or 10 years ago when I first put that slide in one of my classes, that we are in times of some profound economic, democratic, political, environmental, pandemic driven more recently crisis, in which transport and mobility play a very important role. I think I wrote that sentence in my master thesis, then in my doctoral thesis that I defended 6 years ago, and recently in a funding application just submitted 2 months ago. It seems that this state of crisis that is multifaceted with transport and mobility as a very important, maybe not a central, but I think a very important position in something that has become at least a permanent state as long as I remember, as long as I have been involved in academia, as long as I've been studying it and then working on it. And there is a lot of movements around the world, including in Europe, including in Sweden, that recognize the importance of transport and mobility, perhaps centrality of transport and mobility for addressing this crisis and for solving it ultimately, if we do want to come out of this multifaceted conundrum, whether it's the rise of the far right or the climate emergency or rising social inequalities or rights of different social groups that are being excluded in contemporary societies. Transport and mobility is definitely a very important domain to address this. And the examples are abundant. I've chosen the one from Chile. I've written my doctoral dissertation about fair free public transport, and I was always very much inspired by what the activists they were doing in relation to the fare hike in the metro of Santiago de Chile in Latin America. For them, this increase of pricing of transport, public transport, was a symbol of extreme neoliberalization of the system. And they used transport, in particular metro stations, as a strategic space to contest it, jumping over the gates, yes, putting fire, using violence, but manifesting their anger and the very structural issues underpinning transport mobility by focusing on this very specific issue, very specific space. I don't need to introduce the lady on the bottom left. Oops, I just realized that you don't see what I'm How does that work? It has not changed. Basically, the point is here that there is indeed a growing number of movements that are contesting this multifaceted crisis and recognizing the centrality of transport in it. And I mentioned Chile, I mentioned Greta Thunberg, that you of course all know very well, for whom, well, there is a necessity to radically transform our life, and that very much includes mobility, and she's very vocal about how she travels to different appointments and meetings and resistances that she joins. And also very locally, I mean, the place that I'm currently based in, I've lived there for almost 15 years now, Brussels, very often, and I would say more frequently than ever before, sees these movements occupy public space, very vocally express, articulate the needs and desires with regard to transport and mobility. In particular, of course, this is probably not very surprising, the presence of private individual vehicles, especially the cars, in public space. So the idea that cars need to maybe not go away completely, but they have to be, the space that is dedicated to them has to be reduced. Now, well, I'm moving to the next slide. I hope you can follow in a moment. What is the answer that the so-called industry gives us? We really tap into the transport conferences, engineering consortia, companies. If we go to not so critical circuit of production of knowledge about transport and mobility, the answer is quite simple, and it's very, very positive and very optimistic. Automation of vehicles, electrification of the said vehicles as well, and platformization of services. I can recap once again. Social movements recognizing the centrality of transport and mobility and the crisis that we are seeing, or I've been at least seeing for the past 10 years, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the industry that says, no problem, all the problems can be technologically solved. There is no technology that has not, well, no social problem can, there is no social problem that cannot be solved with a technological solution, such as the automation of vehicles, the electrification as well, and platformization of services. And this is what the industry and a lot of transport researchers as well, probably not many present here, have been advocating as an ultimate solution to the current inequalities, climate-related performance of transport, and different other issues that these social movements are highlighting as well. So there is a strong pretense that these technological solutions, which I will not hide, I strongly consider to be largely gimmicks rather than actual solutions that really introduce some kind of future that we really want to see on this planet. But there is a pretense that they are indeed addressing structural issues behind transport and mobility today, across diverse facets of what actually transport and mobility is. And I think I could propose, but this list probably isn't complete, that what transport and mobility is of course not just the infrastructure or policy, but is first of all the knowledge production and exchange. So what we hopefully doing here today, what I'm trying to do here, sharing my knowledge and learning from you as well, and vice versa, that hopefully leads to some policy formulation that underpins the construction of infrastructure that involves certain labor that is performed in transport and mobility. Let's not forget that this is a very important domain of work, of labor. And that ultimately leads to some practice, behavior, and experience. Whereas a lot of the current not so critical research on transport very much tends to focus on the infrastructural part of things, and then maybe somewhere there is practice and behavior. It's not a coincidence I'll mention this textbook of Geography of Transport Systems by Jean-Paul Rodrigue, one of the main textbooks to transport geography or transport studies per se, strongly recognizes that anything political is the enemy of transport. So basically the problem with transport is that there's politics in it. And the moment you eject the political, the flows start flowing better and things, well, the problems get significantly reduced. What this means is that for over 5 or 6 decades, at least in the global north, there's been a very commanding ideological position in transport studies, and both transport and mobility. There is, of course, a difference between the two. I'll probably be using them somewhat interchangeably, and I could, if necessary or if interesting, we could discuss what's the difference between the two. But for me, they are largely two sides of the same coin, let's say. And that position is represented by transport engineering on the one hand and transport economics on the other, where transport engineers tend to focus more on the management of transport systems as such, as a whole, based on different models that predict demand and satisfy it through efficient supply. Whereas the transport economics would be much more interested in the individual performance or behavior of a user as a rational individual customer or a consumer of transport as a good in a transport market. Both interested in maximizing the efficiency and maximizing the utility of transport, which per se is not a problem. I mean, we want transport to be efficient and we want it to be, utility-based. The problem is that pretty much anything else other than efficiency in the utility would be ejected from the analysis, from the debate, and then result in production of infrastructure, labor that is enacted, and practice that is involved. Right. So I will briefly discuss what this field of what I refer to as neoclassical perspectives on transport actually involves, and what are the main principles that it follows. Neoclassical coming from largely the field of neoclassical economics that deal with achieving this precarious balance in the dance between supply and demand in very different markets that are available, of which transport is one. So basically there is this idea here, there is this approach here to transport as an essentially, a type of a market in which us as consumers, as passengers, as users, are engaging and consuming different ways of moving around in a rational fashion. So on the one hand, the idea here is that transport is a largely technical, expert-led and top-down discipline. It is a discipline that is boxed in. It's closed, it's decided about, it's designed, analyzed by those who have, sufficient knowledge to do so. It's not supposed to be a discipline such as, for example, the design of public space, environment, or even housing, where non-experts should have any say. I mean, they can be involved to some extent, but as limited as possible. I might sound a little bit extreme here and caricaturizing a little bit, but if you dive into the textbook of transport engineering, if you go to transport engineering conferences, which I did at the beginning of my PhD to expand my horizons, well, the user-based perspective is completely absent. I mean, at best, there is this idea that we can engage the populace through some apps and other digital tools, but the idea is definitely not to get this on the same horizontal ground. The expert, the engineer/economist knows better, and the gender dimension is very important here, I think, knows what should be done, and the user, consumer, perhaps in brackets also citizen, should follow. The main goal of transport geography, the field that I am approaching transport through, and many other disciplines that deal with transport, so transport economics and transport engineering as well, is quite similar to natural sciences. The idea is that there is some kind of objective truth, objective reality that this discipline can embrace. It's not normative. It's not subjugated to or subjected to different interpretation depending on who is actually producing knowledge and how this knowledge is produced, on what is their gender, what is their class, what is their race, what is their place of origin. Transport is a rational, objective discipline, and through modeling, through analysis, this objective truth can be achieved and enacted. And the main purpose here is to predict the demand and satisfy it, right? To provide supply, sufficient infrastructure, sufficient capacity of a transport system for this demand to be addressed. Where is the user in this? Well, the user, the consumer, is making pragmatic, utility-based choices, free as well, free of politics, of course, free of social tensions, forces, in this model of prediction and provision of transport infrastructure. This also means that the field for many, many decades, and I think still in quite a few journals today, is a highly empirical field with very little interest among transport engineers and economists to actually engage in some theory building. The idea is that data is king. And I mean, as long as you have good data, you can describe reality and provide enough tools for this reality, for the problems that this reality produces, to be addressed. And I think this, while this is an idea coming back from the 70s and 80s and 90s, at least in the global north, we see a huge comeback of this emphasis with, of course, the big data, with the production of all kinds of massive data sets, which supposedly are necessary these days to address any kind of transport-related problem. At least if you listen to some policymakers and also the industry, this is the case. So that's the first kind of idea in neoclassical perspectives on transport. The second one would be that transport is expected without well, with some evidence, but this evidence is very divergent across different geographical contexts. And it really has, at least in recent years and decades, been quite weakened. So the idea that transport is a motor of economic growth. So basically, the more we invest in transport infrastructure, the more we invest in this domain of economics, the higher the speeds, the lower the travel time, and the lower the transaction costs in this particular economic environment that we are operating in, which means that we have some kind of translation into a GDP growth and performance of the economy as a whole. Well, this might work very well in context and has been proven to work in context where indeed transport supply is very, very low and on average very poor. This is extremely complicated to prove in developed countries, especially in the global north. So it's really tricky to show that building a new highway in Belgium, where I'm currently working, will immediately translate, or there is some kind of linear translation to a GDP performance. I guess this might also work in this way in Sweden. So there is quite simply a saturation of infrastructure as well. And this relationship is not so clear. Yet the industry and this ideological field of neoclassical transport studies, let's say, if we call it this way, still continues to approach travel time as a principal problem of transport management, which is deemed which is deemed unproductive, which requires to be monetized. Even, and that's this textbook that I mentioned already today on the geography of transport systems, claims that the unique purpose of transportation is to overcome space, to reduce space to zero as much as possible, and to reduce travel time to zero as much as possible as well. In other words, the key issue with which the neoclassical economists and engineers are dealing with is time and congestion, and reducing it as much as possible to zero is the primary goal of planning, of coining policy, and of building infrastructure. Now, perhaps we don't need to discuss this. I mean, to end this introductory part of my today's presentation, of course, we probably can all imagine, and we all know the result of this approach. And while this might be somewhat of a gist, and it might seem a little bit caricatural, it really has been, and I think it still is, the dominant way in which transport is studied, produced, and enacted. And it has produced, well, we can discuss whether this has been positive and negative, depends, of course, for whom and what geographical context, but it has had a massive impact on how space and society has been produced pretty much globally. I think in particular, I mean, the impact of this is particularly visible, I think, in urban contexts, where the transport engineers and economists have had a heyday of designing infrastructure that satisfies these, follows these principles. So where is society in space in this ideological field? Well, it is devoid of social and political dynamics. It's basically a field of application. It is where the model lands and is being produced, enacted. This is where the highways are built. This is where the railroads are built for the demand to be satisfied. I mean, these are the visions of Le Corbusier's plan for Paris. Luckily, probably luckily not realized. You've got the Notre Dame somewhere there on the little island. The idea being that through monofunctional planning, through physical separation of people from traffic, we can achieve this goal of minimizing congestion, of fluidifying the flows as much as possible through an essentially top-down approach to transport and planning. So of course, there cannot be any debate, there cannot be any discussion about what should be done, because what should be done has been elaborated in a mathematical, nearly social, natural scientific method, with a lot of references to gravitational forces or gravitational models, with the behavior of bacteria or other natural species, as if the transport networks were naturally following these. So there is this strong urge among transport engineers and economists to show that the discipline is actually following natural God-given laws, and these laws have to be applied in whatever context they need to be applied. And now, well, this probably is also known to all of you. Of course, the car, the individual motorized transport, and the car is the main instrument within this realm, has been epitomized this approach to transport and mobility planning for several decades now. What that led to, well, can you see this? Yes, perfect. Is, well, that there's been a very strong need for increasing the capacity of urban transport systems, leading to major road building programs. In the global north, they started approximately 1950s, 1960s, after the Second World War, with, for example, programs such as, or infrastructural projects such as the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Drive in New York, or the Ponte Morandi in Italy, in the northern part of the country. Often these highways, these urban motorways, cutting through very dense, complicated, complex communities, often inhabited by ethnic minorities, the working class, who would have less political leverage, less access to political power, less possibility for resistance. Nonetheless, of course, the resistance also existed against this, what was in the US called motorway madness. And there was also this was also the time of the beginning of a critique of this approach, but perhaps we will move to the critique a little bit later. I picked the Ponte Morandi also for a particular reason that, well, probably some of you might know. The bridge actually tragically collapsed several years ago with, I believe, 50 or 60 people dying, which also highlights that we have perhaps reached a point of reflection about what to do with this infrastructure. So it had its kind of expiry date has arrived, and it either requires urgent renovation, renewal, reinvestment, or perhaps it should be actually made obsolete, and we should not be rebuilding this anymore. I'm not sure what they actually decided to do in Italy, but well, where I am currently based in Belgium, the clear push is to renovate this infrastructure as a basis for our transport systems. Nobody in their mind wants the tunnels, highways, viaducts to go away, the ones at least that are built already. What's quite remarkable is that this approach has had no, or pretty much no geographical boundaries. So where it could be applied, it was, whether in capitalist West or in the socialist, communist East. So this is my hometown of Wrocław in southwestern Poland, the country's capital, Warsaw, with the country's very first urban highway, the West-East Highway, which still very much exists. Sorry, the West-East is in Wrocław. This is Łazienkowska Highway, also a very important one until today in the urban mobility of the city. And this was applied in the north, in the east, and in the south as well. Here's Havana, where actually these principles arrived already quite early in the 1950s. The Tunnel of Havana built in 1957-58. And an example of what I will probably allude to as well a little bit towards the end of my presentation, the former colony used as a testing ground for a lot of innovations, for a lot of infrastructure. So this was a very unique construction that the government of Cuba, already the pre-revolutionary one, was very much interested in adopting, something that probably could not be done in many other contexts around the world. And my current home, Brussels, the so-called Petite Ceinture, so a small belt road or a small ring road around the second walls of the medieval city of Brussels, the walls erected in the 14th century, demolished in the 19th century, replaced with a magnificent urban boulevard where you could walk, horse ride, or cycle. And in the 1950s, the idea is that this has to be transformed into a fully motorized or car-friendly space, because the car is, of course, the most modern, the best, the fastest, and the most freedom-inducing mode of travel. And the works begin, and they lasted for almost 20 years, which is absolutely incredible to think of, that basically using the cut and cover technique, a metro line, and that would cut this square horizontally, and an urban highway that would cut it vertically, so from south to north and east to west, multiple tunnels being built for almost 20 years. So the ring road itself, here we see a particular spot on it. Of course, the ring road itself is 8 kilometers long. It has, I don't remember, 15 tunnels. I just see it in my notes now. And this is not a coincidence, since the Belgian engineers at that point were receiving so-called concrete bonus, which sounds like a pun, but actually it isn't. So basically for every kilometer of a tunnel built, they would receive a personal bonus on their monthly salary. So the more tunnels they built, the more they earned. So the idea quickly made Belgium an absolute leader in tunnel construction, which it is today. So for example, our public transport company is divided into two departments. One is metro and the other one is everything else, which if you, well, probably it's not a surprise if you ask them what should be done. Half of the engineers say new metro line and the other ones are, well, probably not in such strong disagreement either. And this is, well, I digress. So, of course, this means that not only car infrastructure was built, such as highways and all that, but also that the public space would be very much given to the car. This is Grand Place, a UNESCO heritage site today. Well, in the 1960s and 70s, it was a parking, basically, for the cars. This was the idea. The idea was that to make a city modern, to make a city show its sign of progress, it has to be open, or its urban space has to be open to the car. And this was done in Brussels, as in many other cities, I imagine in Sweden, Ireland, Georgia as well. And this, of course, is paired with another parallel process which completely changed the face of society and space that we live in, is that of suburbanization. So the idea is that the car opens this possibility for traveling longer distances at shorter time and higher speeds, which means that location policy, real estate policy can change, and different greenfield areas outside of dense medieval urban cores, where there's all these resistances from ethnic minorities, migrants, the working class who are dissatisfied with the construction of car infrastructure. So the middle class, and that's at least the Belgian story, can very easily run away from the city, escape it to the spacious, lush, green, airy spaces in the suburbs. And this is exactly what happened in Belgium in the 1960s and 70s, as I imagine in many other Western European countries, where we have a dual dynamic of the working class suffering from the road construction, the middle class ejected from it, and the new migrants arriving from all different countries around the world, in our case, from mostly Maghreb in Eastern Europe, and in Southern Europe and Maghreb. So the city is becoming an increasingly diverse melting pot, whereas the old middle or upper class bourgeoisie, the white Belgians, are leaving the city to the suburbs. And this is a process which is, funnily enough, continuing today. I will probably show a few slides about that later on. So this is not something that belongs to the 1960s and 70s. This is a dynamic which, through transport and mobility, has been enabled and goes on until now. Now, everything that is great and good must come to an end, or at least that's what it seems to be an end. And what happened in the 1970s with the two oil crises, first in 1973 and the 1979 related to the Iranian Revolution, was that suddenly the supply, it seemed continuous and unabated, of petrol at good, low prices suddenly ended, or at least it was questioned. And that led to a serious reflection on the environmental, first economic, then the environmental impact of automobility on urban development, urban environment, or environment as such, and on the, well, economic and social feasibility of this model. And at least in the global north, because I'm not really discussing all kinds of communities that, for example, indigenous communities, for example, that exist in the global south, for whom this model of development has never really been the model, and they've been questioning and criticizing it ever since it arrived to their communities. But in the global north, the beginning of a reflection about the limits to this kind of policy and transport and mobility has started on a serious level and serious scale in the 1970s and 1980s. And we see from then on beginning of a reflection on what probably would call car-related externalities. On the one hand, the environmental ones, so related to noise and vibration, air pollution, road accidents. The spatial ones, so there is for the first time a recognition that the car has actually eaten into a significant amount of public space, and perhaps this is problematic. And sprawl also is for the very first time in the global north discussed as an issue that might need tackling or addressing or curbing at least. And then at the same time, there is also a push for the automotive industry, or within the automotive industry, to start reducing, well, first of all, the fuel consumption. The fuel was important, and for the very first time, the consumer would actually ask, how much does this car consume in terms of gas? So different technologies of engine efficiency, different policy-related technologies, innovations related, for example, to limitation of speed, and a general search for alternative fuel sources. So going back to, as far as I understand, there was already Tim Schwannen's lecture about this, the idea of electrification, for example, of cars as an alternative to carbon-based fuel, such as petrol. Now, of course, fast forwarding to the situation today, or perhaps around 2010s, we have now, well, pretty much a global consensus that car-based mobility and mobility as such is a very important, if not crucial, contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 emissions. And well, the problem of the car, the way that it's been designed, rolled out, promoted through the neoclassical perspective of transport, is not just a question of public space, it's not just a question of demolishing, turning upside down the very complex social and spatial tissue of different communities that we inhabit across, as I showed, very different contexts in the global north, south, and east, but it's very much an environmental problem. And this is where we start reframing transport as a question of sustainable development, a question of sustainability of our very existence on this planet, primarily as an environmental problem. Because we see that on the one hand, transport and mobility this domain is one of the largest sources of air pollution, of greenhouse gas emissions as well in different localities. This might vary from case to case. For example, in my native Poland, this still actually comes mostly from individual heating systems. So actually from people trying to heat up their houses in winter rather than their cars. This might also be the case in China to some extent. But globally, transport unequivocally is a very important source of air pollution on a local scale. Whereas globally, what's happening is that in 2010, according to an IPCC report published 4 years later, at that point, global CO2 emissions from the domain of transport amounted to about 14% of global CO2 emissions. So transport really rose to be a very important sector within this market of producing CO2 emissions. And at the same time, and I will show some slides in a moment, it already was one of the fastest growing sectors in this context. From 2010 to 2019, this contribution has increased, or maybe not 2019, but 2022, 23, if I remember the latest data, it's increased from 14% to about 24%. So it really almost doubled its contribution, in inverted commas, to the production of CO2 globally. Which means that global climate problems are increasingly transport problems. Without addressing transport and the way that it interacts with environment, well, we probably cannot really stop the climate change or climate catastrophe, or however we want to call it. So this is not just a question anymore of our own well-being on a local scale, but it is a global issue. And this, of course, very much relates to the activities of Greta Thunberg, for example, or many other activists have highlighted this and have done so for a number of years already. Now, within the very domain of transport, of course, the problem is not all transport modes and means and instruments and vehicles are the same. And we see that a great share of the emissions are related to road transport. This was at least the case, and this increase is very clear in blue. Oof, that scared me for a moment. From 1970s to 2010. And so basically within the domain of transport, it's particularly road transport that is problematic. And if we move it a little bit forward, so we look at the data from 2000 and 2018, from one of the latest reports on the matter, we see that the road transport includes both passenger and freight transport as both very problematic sectors. So this increase is very fast, the share is very fast, and that basically means that, well, global climate problems are increasingly being perceived and also demonstrated to be road or car-related problems, which leads, and I will show it in a moment, to very often a reduction of this very complex situation to a very simplistic recipe or a very simplistic approach, which is that the car is the problem. So the idea is that the moment we get rid or reduce the presence of this particular mode of travel, this particular instrument of travel, the climate problems, environmental problems, social problems, and political problems related to transport mobility will be somewhat solved. Well, car is definitely a problem, or it is definitely an increasingly present mode of transport around the world. We see the global cumulative number of registered cars in millions that has been rising since the 1960s through 80s, 2000, 2020, and the prediction for 2040. So the global number of vehicles that we can consider as cars is rising, and this is an exponential rise. It's not a rise that is slow by any means. I have not added figures for the years after the pandemic. The pandemic introduced some kind of a slump, but then it really skyrocketed right afterwards. But we see, and these are not cumulative, but they are basically separate numbers for each year, distributed into different regions. We see that the cars are still being sold in huge numbers around the world, with whereas some markets perhaps have a little bit decreased. The European Union is there in yellow, US is in light green. We see the rise of China in blue right at the bottom of the graph, which, well, was definitely not a very big market. Well, still was, of course, in 2005, but compared to 2016-17, it really almost tripled its size. Another dynamic that we see is, well, not all cars are equal, of course. What we see, and that's perhaps quite worrying, is that, and that's the top graph, the proportion of the so-called sports utility vehicles that are sold as a share of all these global car sales is really increasing. And I mean, we see this, of course, in media. We see it being discussed by different stakeholders. But when you see a graph like this, you really start wondering that, well, it's not the car that is being sold, or the average car that is being sold today is really not the same as 10 or 15 years ago, in terms of the amount of materials that it requires, in terms of the amount of fuel that it requires, and of course also in terms of the amount of space that it requires. And there's reports about cars not fitting parking spaces around different places, especially in Western Europe, in dense cities where these parking spaces would be generally quite limited, and the cars simply do not fit sometimes. Not to mention, of course, the question of pedestrian and cyclist safety. Having an accident against an SUV as opposed to a normal compact vehicle that we sold in the 1990s, 2000, that's a different story entirely. At the same time, of course, there is also an increase of sales of the so-called electric vehicles, whether battery electric vehicles or hybrid or plug-in hybrid. So there is this happening as well, which takes me all the way back to the very beginning, let's say, of this industry-led recipe to transport and mobility-related problems. When the industry proposes that we electrify vehicles, well, my question would be, do SUVs that are electric also count as a solution to the problem, or is this just a little bit, of a window dressing of that problem in itself? And at the same time, and this is perhaps somewhat less relevant, but me being an urban geographer and an urban scholar, I find it important to mention, the transport-related problems and car-related problems are increasingly urban. Not only because, and I mean, there was a time, perhaps 10, 15 years ago, where every report on the state of the world would start by the statement that the more people now live in cities than elsewhere in the countryside. So we have become an urban community. But it is a fact that we are increasingly an urban planet. We are living, most of us these days, are living in cities or in contexts that could be recognized as urban. And the demand for urban mobility is rising. It's already today assessed, though I am not sure that this data is very reliable, but UITP, so the International Union for Public Transport, claims that 60% of all passenger mobility around the world in terms of kilometers is actually done in urban mobility rather than interurban. So we are moving very locally as a species, across different societies, and most of this mobility is actually done in cities. So a lot of solutions that we need to come up with have to be urban solutions. They have to be for not long distance mobility, but not, or at least not necessarily, but for short to mid distance mobility. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of policymakers, researchers, activists have fallen, I think, into the trap or the tendency of reducing this complexity, reducing this. I mean, I've also been very brief about this, and of course we can have a very long discussion about the roots of these problems and the structural causes behind this unsustainability and what transport and mobility does to this. But there is a tendency to reduce this problem to a simple recipe, to recognize that the key problem in transport planning and policy is not congestion now, So we don't want the flows to be flowing as uninterruptedly as possible. But the problem is the car as the main culprit, as the main individual motorized vehicle available to humanity at present. And I mean, the examples of this are numerous, and they started quite early. Here is some screens from one of my favorite films by Jacques Tati, Playtime, from the 1967, where he uses the car for him, I believe the car would be the symbol of modernism, of progress, of some kind of infatuation of humanities with this particular toy that has been shared around in the middle classes of Western Europe. But of course, there's more, and I imagine that you all are on social media and you follow a number of accounts, influencers, think tanks that I think the production of content that goes against the car and focuses on this particular mode of travel as problematic is massive. And I'm definitely not here to say that it's wrong, but I'm saying that it's sometimes a little bit simplistic as some of these examples are showing. Just looking at the time here, perhaps I should speed up a little bit. So in academia, though, or in more scholarly debates, I think I also don't want to be critical and definitely not go to any ad personam critiques, but I feel that some of the concepts and some of the debates that have been had, inspired by this critique of the car, have also fallen into some kind of simplistic mode. And I think that this might be the case to an extent of the so-called sustainable mobility paradigm, which perhaps is one of the main proposals coming from this discussion or reflection on the role of transport and mobility in creating unsustainability or generating essentially unsustainable societies and spaces. I imagine that most of you are familiar with this approach or with this concept, so I'm not going to discuss it too much. Well, generally, the idea is to create some links between the land use and transport to end with monofunctionalism, or to at least challenge it, to generate a model shift away from the car towards all other modes, specifically or primarily public transport and also active modes. And seriously, for the first time, at least in the global north, discuss or reflect on the role of the bottom-up actors. So basically challenge the idea that transport is an essentially top-down discipline that is run by experts alone, especially those from engineering and economics. And where is the urban space in society, if we agree that the urban space is perhaps particularly important in this challenge, although this is of course not all about cities? Well, the ideas that emerge from this concept are really quite convincing. I mean, they're all very positive. The idea is that if we do this, if we merge land use and transport policy, if we generate the model shift towards public transport and active modes, we arrive at some levels of viability, vibrancy. We make our spaces and communities more attractive and affordable, socially cohesive, healthy, participative. It's all fantastic. The problem is that there is no conflict there. I mean, who would be against that? The thing that I will try to show in the remainder of the presentation is that, well, there are very strong interests against that vision, and there is a lot of stakeholders, actors, citizens who are absolutely not convinced by this because of structural inequalities and structural causes behind unsustainability that I would say that sustainable mobility paradigm does not really address or does not really have the tools to unpack. So this is a very interesting recipe, but it does not really address the structural problems that actually made the unsustainability happen. So I will race through this because I don't think this is the most interesting part of the presentation, and indeed time is, I would much rather listen to your questions and have a discussion with you than just talk. So, I mean, there is a lot of policies in practice emerging from this, either focused on tackling automobility. You can see that I still was doing some comments on my own slides, but this is fine. So, yeah, tackling automobility or trying to indeed increase the quality of public transport accessibility and the general offer. So both on the, let's say, the stick side of the policy and the carrot side of the policy. Detracting people from car use and attracting them to public transport use. So the key problem that emerges here is that the sustainable transport as a concept, as a field as well, as an approach to transport, has this appearance of being quite radical. has this appearance of being a proposal. Of course, this is not a very new proposal. It goes back to the 1980s, 90s, perhaps. As I showed, the reflection is probably even earlier, from the 1970s, around these around these oil crises. But it still carries this aura of being, in many contexts, a radical vision, a radical idea for planning a city, for example. And it is, and this is where I probably put my Eastern European hat, it is very uncritically reproduced across different geographical contexts. So you see the main thinkers of this approach being very uncritically translated to many languages. Jan Gehl, the Danish neighbor of yours, I think he's really had a particularly good success with his book translated to dozens of languages. Polish definitely not being the last one. But there's also many other local productions like The City in Plus, or by a Polish activist, Happy City. And so all these kind of ideas of how to make a city a better place without, I would say, much reflection on, well, who's on board and who is not necessarily in favor of this transition, and how do we get them on board, and what are the different interests that are blocking this transition. So this is very much shown and discussed as a very, again, rather technical process. Jan Gehl, for instance, calculating the publicness of spaces using his own models, but they are not necessarily rooted in any particular geographical context where they are being applied, where he is doing the analysis. And also not much reflection on the social tensions and conflicts that might be there in place. So the problem is, yes, indeed, I could develop these images. So this is a note to myself from the past. So the problem is perhaps that there is a dialogue, or at least a perception of dialogue between the neoclassical field with transport engineers and economists on the one hand, and the sustainable scholars, activists, practitioners on the other. One would say, yes, let's not abandon completely the question of congestion, time travel, and monetization of all this, because transport is efficient and rational, and it is utility-based. The other saying, yes, but the car is the problem, we should also reduce its presence. And we could continue like this forever if we focus, I mean, if we listen to ExxonMobil and Toyota, they are sustainable too, you know, and we're all sustainable. So this is also a question of perhaps losing a little bit our language. And if ExxonMobil is sustainable, then I don't know what that means anymore. And we really need new tools or new ways of framing this reality in order to change it, to actually understand what it is, and then change that. And I think this debate in academia, policy circles, and activists is largely, I think, unproductive and also very exclusive. So my proposal, and this is where I move to what I think could be defined as the, let's say, a rising field of more critical approaches to transport and mobility, is considering transport with all its different facets. So the knowledge production, policy, infrastructure, practice, as key elements of urban political economy, or political economy, if we're not just focusing on the urban environments, which goes back to critical traditions of social theory, geographical theory, that shows us that space and society are by no means products of any natural laws or processes. So this is definitely not a natural science. There are no God-given laws that govern how space is planned and produced. It is all extremely political, not just because it's being designed by some political institutions, but that basically the very process of doing something in space and society is political, and transport and mobility is part of that. And if we, in Sweden, Belgium, Poland, these days, live in a society that largely follows the economic model called capitalism, well, then these are very much capitalist relations and very much capitalist dynamics in which transport and mobility play a very important part. They are both influenced by it. I will show some examples of how, for instance, neoliberalization plays out and how transport and mobility has changed by the arrival of neoliberal narratives or neoliberal ideas. But also transport as such actually allows capitalism to exist through, for example, the separation of the worker from the workplace, allowing the worker to live in one spot and work in another, creating some kind of atomization, preventing the workers from organizing. This is an idea that actually goes back to the very roots of the idea of public transport. In Belgium, where I'm based, this is why public transport is still heavily subsidized by the state. It goes back to the idea of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, the bourgeoisie being extremely cautious about the workers being able to organize after work around factory. So they were given almost free public transport tickets to commute to their villages, so that they would go after work straight home. and not discuss what happened in the factory with the colleagues. They didn't, of course, succeed. The socialist revolution happened anyway, but well, maybe to a lesser degree than in France or the UK. Anyway, accelerating a bit, because indeed it's up to until 5 that we have the time, right?
Yeah, we can have 10 minutes.
Great. I will try to take exactly that, maybe a little bit more. So I will point out several problems. I mean, applying this perspective or this set of perspectives to sustainable transport, well, allows us to see a number of problems with the way that sustainable perspective to transport and mobility perceive it. On the one hand, there is still a lot of technological determinism. And if it's not the car that we want to develop in our space and society, it's exactly the electric vehicles, the automated vehicles, the platform-based services, which sustainable approaches to transport very much incorporate. I mean, the idea that the electric car will be a positive contributor to the world is there to be found in many papers, many books by sustainable transport scholars. And well, perhaps we don't have to focus on the Elon Musk himself. Back in the 2017, when he said that he was just an owner of Tesla and a few other companies, now he's a far-right spin doctor, but he clearly does not like public transport, and I think that's for a reason. As an automotive industry guru or whatever he actually is. Then another problem with sustainable transport and this vision for sustainable urban planning, public transport oriented and not so much car oriented, merging land use and transport policy, is that while in principle, of course, this is a very positive vision, when we see the actual realizations of this vision, which might, of course, say as much about the policymakers and the planners that are in place as about the scholars that actually are behind this perspective, is that these realizations very often include a very uneven geography. So vertically, what we often see is that space or surface can be saved from the car and its detrimental effect on space and society. But in fact, the car is hidden out of sight, either in tunnels or different other infrastructures that are basically shifted underground. And I mean, this is the case of many parks, of many public spaces in Western Europe today, where if you want to get a park, if you want to get a new green infrastructure, often the hidden cost of it is actually shoving the car underground. And another horizontal unevenness, if you will, is that there is this very specific geography, I feel, about which relates to what kind of spaces are saved from the car and its detrimental effects. And I don't think it's a coincidence that these spaces very often are located in dense urban cores with potential rent gaps, with very high capacity for generating rent and touristification and beautification of spaces, rather than the suburbs and more peripheral areas. So it's much easier to find a pedestrian zone and some kind of a space that is inspired by sustainable transport planning in the urban centers or neighborhoods in transition that are probably en route towards gentrification than in suburban spaces, for which the concepts such as 15-minute city or cities for people suddenly do not apply that well, or they need to be adapted, or there is a whole reflection on how to actually, what do we do with all these suburbs that we built? And then very often there is the exercise of finger pointing as well. But those who live in the suburbs, they chose to live there, and that's maybe they are at fault, and suddenly this becomes a bit of an individual problem or discussion that, well, where people are being blamed for where they live and how they move, which is, I'm going to get to that in a moment. We can probably skip that. I wanted to tell you a little bit about the story of the pedestrian. For a few years, it was the largest pedestrian zone in Europe, the one in Brussels, and how it was designed, but perhaps we don't have time for that. Just perfectly okay. There is a question of participation here as well, since sustainable transport planning and sustainable transport policy are much more vocal or much more cognizant of the users, passengers, citizens in general. But there's absolutely no guarantee that this leads to any change of power relations. And what we see is that, well, while the sustainability might be the new or not so new thing in town, it still is the transport planner, it still is the transport expert that decides what is being done. And we still, I think, at least in the Belgian context, struggling very much with developing processes that really engage the population, which really give not just the voice, but really value the capacity and the knowledge of people who are there on the ground, who engage in mobility on a daily basis. The challenge here is that if we don't do this properly, then of course any change in space related to transport and mobility that we engage in might generate serious discontent, and we see this being, at least in the Belgian context, I don't know how it is here, very neatly captured by the far right, who suddenly includes low emission zones, low traffic zones in the political pamphlets as an example of something they don't want to see in the world. And this is perhaps because for a long time, sustainable transport has, I think, essentially failed to avoid the atomization and individualization of the problem. So to a large extent, this is still approached as an individual question of convincing people to do the right thing. So there's this kind of pedagogical exercise in which we as scholars, practitioners, planners have to engage in, to convince, for example, this young French woman to walk to different spaces that she uses in her daily life, which on the one hand I understand, on the other hand it really feels to me like an infantilization of a daily mobility experience, as if people had to be really taught how to travel. I mean, I think we need not to be reminded that people drive not because they were taught how to drive, but they were given a fantastic opportunity to live in the suburbs, get a car, and they were told that this is a perfectly normal thing to do in the 1970s and 80s. So this was not so much of an individual choice as a state policy, at least in many Western European countries. I'll get to that if there is time. So what are the alternatives to this neoclassical sustainable paradigm now that we have deconstructed the latter? So what are the ways of doing critical transport science? And I will spend the last minutes highlighting some avenues for research, some research questions on some different domains that we can all engage with here. I think first and foremost, and this is perhaps my Marxist beginnings talking here, was naive and young. I am still naive. Not so young perhaps, is looking at transport as very much a vehicle for social struggle. I mean, if it is a political object, if it is a essentially political activity, we really do not need to look far to see that just like the social movements I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk, today they're not only arguing for something in transport, they are burning or attacking tram stops in East Jerusalem. This is way before everything that's happening right now in Gaza. And the Palestinian activists in East Jerusalem were considering a light rail project there as a colonial project. The Gilets jaunes, so the Yellow Vest movement, all kinds of protests related to fares and control instruments in New York. And again, my lovely Brussels, perhaps a little bit more peaceful and less violent, but still also very vocal. So transport is very clearly, for many movements and for many activists out there, a place where you really struggle for a better future, with the use of violence or not. So it's very strange that many transport academics on the neoclassical but on the sustainable side try to say that this is, this is not necessarily the case. This is a rather peaceful field, not so technical perhaps anymore, but this is definitely not where we should start, burning things and really being articulate about the system or whatever the evil and the enemy that we are trying to fight against is called. Then I think there is a whole it's a pity that these comments are still visible, but probably there was a structural way of hiding them. But actually, let's maybe not screw things up more than they are already. So I think crucial aspect here in the critical approaches to transport is lies in recognizing and really engaging with the structural causes behind sustainability, different social, political, economic interests, regulatory frameworks, power relations that are strongly embedded in transport. And I think here it's a very small digression, a very small note showing at least part of the picture why current transport and mobility situation is a structural, is written with structural problems rather than individual decisions. If we agree that the great majority of contexts, urban or not, in the global north are plagued with automobility, and this is a problem, whether we are neoclassical sustainable scholars. In the European Union alone, we see that 75% of all trips are being done with motorized vehicles, with a car. But this is very strongly related to what I briefly mentioned earlier, with this development of a very strong binding consensus with the state as absolutely foundational actor in Western Europe after the Second World War, in Eastern Europe more after 1988, which first allowed for consumption of individual motorized vehicles. It allowed for consumption of a car as a commodity that would be both a mobility instrument and also a question of social status, of some kind of a rising to the middle class, of being a member of a society, of belonging, and also creating a model of individual housing ownership which hinges on suburbanization, which in Belgium and Poland, so two countries where I'm somewhat embedded, very much continues. Despite all the critique from academia and activist circles, this is still the predominant model of urban development or spatial development in these countries. This continues, and continues in Poland and continues in the UK. I mean, I could look for many more pictures of recent developments that are very suburban in kind, that look very much like, well, it's US rather than Europe. So the question is whether this is an individual choice of these consumers to buy property over there and commute by car, or rather a state-led or state-facilitated policy that generates these communities and then have the inhabitants being individually blamed for their choices. I think that this is absolutely nothing to do with individual behavior, but rather a policy choice. And there's absolutely nothing natural about the development of such communities and the continued suburbanization and continued automobility. Now, perhaps, yeah, we could skip this, looking at the time. Yeah, there was a question of, yes, indeed, neoliberalization of transport and this kind of dilemma between, well, introducing new regulatory measures, procurement and all this, which on the one hand, well, has, let's say, made the transport market more dynamic, but on the other hand, generates very strange situations, very uneven geographies of transport provision, such as in Spain. This is a map from 2021 of all rail routes that have been discontinued in the past 20 or 30 years. So you could actually create a whole rail network of from the lines that were discontinued, destroyed, demolished. In many cases, we mentioned this over lunch, actually, they were turned into green routes for cyclists with European Union money. So the idea of converting local train services into something else, while developing, of course, a magnificent high-class, high-speed rail system. So creating a very uneven geography of that. Here is an image from my native Poland. So you see in red all passenger service terminated since the 1989 until more or less today. And green, those where the service is pretty much completely reduced to zero. So you have a single service daily or weekly. Again, you could probably create a network out of these services alone. So the idea of creating a very divisive and very uneven geography, focusing not so much on a social mission of providing transport across territory and for the whole citizenry, but providing transport where it's mostly beneficial. So creating a focus much more on the stakeholder benefit than on societal benefits. How much time do I have? 5 minutes. Let's see. And perhaps the last point with which I want to finish relates to also, there is a few more that I will not discuss today. That's perfectly okay. I think as critical transport scholars, we also need to look a little bit outside the box in terms of what kind of solutions, what kind of concepts are being shared with us, sold to us, what kind of ideas we are interacting with. And I think there has been a very strong trend in the past 10, 20 years of standardizing the concepts that are being used in urban transport studies and urban mobility, but also, of course, with serious consequences for policy making and for construction of infrastructure, for actually doing things in transport and mobility. This is, on the one hand, related to some kind of territorial competition, which is essential to the neoliberal society or economy. We see different localities, different actors competing with one another for external investment, for external capital, and transport and mobility is an essential part of this. So the idea of, let's say, providing quality public transport is not only about actually improving the mobility experience and mobility quality for the local citizenry, but it's also about projecting an image of being a territory that is progressive, that is developed, that is modern, etc., etc. And there is a market for a lot of products and a lot of solutions that are available for policymakers that are interested in engaging in this exercise. And we see different cities, different localities that are marketing themselves around these different products. We see different rankings being produced, such as the famous City Livability Index by The Economist, published annually, where usually I think it's Vienna that wins over Singapore, or something like this. So this is a very small Champions League of cities and different territories that compete with one another in terms of who's absolutely the best place to live, with, I think, Luanda in Angola quite regularly being somewhere that was towards the bottom. So there is some kind of a post-colonial also exercise of saying that, yeah, there is a small group of localities in the global north that are absolutely prime locations for you to invest and live in, and for your children to go to a private school, but avoid these places in the global south and east by all standards. And, well, different localities even have institutions, departments, labs, institutes, organize events such as the summits and other networks around the promotion of these tools, different planning techniques, different planning best practices, etc., etc. But we know from first a very global northern literature, but interesting literature nonetheless, that the dynamics of what is called here policy mobility are extremely uneven and political. So the reason why these different localities engage in this exercise is by no means related to sharing objective truth, as the neoclassical transport planners would hope it works. But it is about projecting oneself, it's about achieving something very locally, and it's of course about selling a product, selling an idea that is by no means necessarily applicable to other geographical contexts. So the fact that Amsterdam, Copenhagen, and Brussels might be selling some solutions by no means that another city could actually do this in a similar way, whether this is a tram line, bicycle path, or cycling policy, or urban funiculars, such as this is an innovation coming from Latin America, principally from Colombia. And why am I mentioning this? Because I think that this is part of what, and this is probably what Lela Rekviashvili in the next lecture will be talking about in much more detail, this is part of an ongoing shift towards a much more decolonial or decolonized field, a field where the knowledge that we have about transport, the solutions that we try to apply, the concepts with which we work as transport researchers come from a much more diverse group of localities and much more diverse group of contexts and actors. And I will very briefly show the current bias that our field is suffering from and propose a few avenues for changing this. So first, I think what we are probably going through is this epistemological shift, going from this conundrum of a debate between neoclassical and sustainable approaches and trying to see alternatives to it. So going beyond this hegemony of the two ideologies or two ideological fields, I don't want to say pretending to clash with one another, but engaging in some kind of debate that is not necessarily the most productive. The second one relates to really looking at empirical examples and theories that are emerging from well beyond the global north. The current situation is that if we look at the Shanghai ranking and the civil engineering schools, for example, it's very clear that to become a civil engineer, transport planner, transport engineer, it's not to Africa or Latin America that you must go, but rather to China, Western Europe, US. And I mean, of course, there are very powerful colonial roots behind this particular very uneven geography of knowledge production in academia. Of course, by no means is civil engineering the only field where this kind of geography is being reproduced. I don't think this is particularly strong here, but I think it's strong nonetheless. And perhaps to end this, I mean, this leads to a very fundamental question to which the answer is neither easy nor very comfortable, which is that we really need to reflect how in our field knowledge is produced and by whom and with what interest. And that any exercise of knowledge production, as we know from Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, a New Zealand-based Maori scholar, involves power relations, and they are unequal. The very act of creating knowledge and sharing it is extremely political and involves power relations. And I think the transport field, and here I go to Tim Schwanen and his work on decolonizing transport. I know that he was with you a few weeks ago. Perhaps transport studies are not exactly a field that is particularly unique here. And I mean, you could say the same thing about sociology, even anthropology, that has very much engaged or tried to engage with decolonial theory. But what transport is, I think, still very much doing, transport and mobility, is, I think, not necessarily engaging with this debate and pretending that, well, where knowledge comes from, producing it in Sweden or Belgium and Poland is not necessarily a political fact. This is somewhat making things still very much in a neutral fashion. So if we come up with a solution or a problem definition in this particular locality that we are in, or in my native Poland, or where I am in Brussels, this is supposedly a neutral fact. But, well, we see that still there is a very strong division of academic labor in transport as in other disciplines, whereby we as academics in the global north are very much responsible for creating debates, organizing lecture series, for example, discussing different concepts, discussing the theory and coining it. And the empirics is where, or the South is where the empirics is collected. So it's very rare to see big academics, big names, concepts and theories emerging from the South, from Latin America, from Africa, even Southeast Asia, although perhaps there are some exceptions, which to me, I'm not alone, I think, really feels a bit as if we are engaging in a logic that is still very much colonial, in which we are producing the tools with which the whole world has to be studied. And the diversification of these tools is still a process that we are, well, yet to engage in. And to end this is really the last slide. Well, I'm definitely part of the problem, in a sense that while I am very much an Eastern European and born in Poland, I was educated in Belgium and many other Western European countries through the Erasmus program and its different derivatives. But the might, power, funding, and the position of the university as the institution that I'm in is very much related to the position of Belgium as a post-colonial power. And I think that this is, in any discipline, and I don't think that transport is an exception, this is something that has to be recognized. So, I end here. There's many things that I could share. The slides are still not finished, but I think let's hear from the audience. Let's have some questions, have some discussion. So I put a dot here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Wojciech, for this very interesting lecture. Despite technical difficulties, we still learned a lot. So we have roughly 20 to 25 minutes for discussion. If there are questions, we can just start straight. Yes.
Yeah, well,
It's for the.
I'll mute myself, I guess.
Brilliant presentation, despite the technical.
Okay.
Yes, well done for getting through the technical difficulties.
Thank you.
I think if I was to summarize what you're talking about here is that the status quo transport engineering and neoclassical economic solution is to essentially electrify the Hummer, electrify the SUV, the kind of greening of business as usual. But the questions I wanted to raise is around the connection, is actually similar to what Catherine's presentation brought up for me, the intimate connection between neoclassical economics and capitalism. It seems to me that part of the problem here, and this relates then to the issue of colonization and the kind of imperialist logic that you pointed out, is that on the one hand, the externalities of car-based mobility, EV included, don't get calculated. So the impact on public health, injury, air pollution, that doesn't count in the neoclassical cost-benefit analysis. Essentially, neoclassical economics and capitalism is a fantastic externalizing machine. You externalize the cost and so on. So I wonder if you wanted to make some comment on that. And then particularly the class basis. Even before you came to the Musk quote, there's a famous quote from Margaret Thatcher who said, if you're a 24-year-old in Britain and you're sitting on a bus, you're a failure. Yeah. The ways in which success, status, and so on are tied up with mobility. And then the last one has to do with something you didn't touch upon, which has to do about the immaterial cultural dynamics around transportation. You know, the ways in which, for example, popular culture, particularly American popular culture, you know, you've got the road movie, you've got the, you know, projection of automobility as autonomy, as freedom, which is reproduced in a way in cultural forms. Because it does seem to me that even if you have as much technical efficiency, even with ICE, internal combustion engine cars, the problem is the rebound effect.
Yeah.
It is true that cars today are immeasurably more resource and fuel efficient, but unless you've got a reduction in demand, it doesn't matter a damn. All the efficiencies and resource savings are, undermined. So perhaps just if you want to pick one of those, I'd be interested in your reflection on the cultural reproduction of automobility and how do we challenge that?
Do we take a few questions or I answer immediately? How do we? Okay, great. Thank you. Lots of questions there. I would say that for me, perhaps I indeed didn't discuss this in detail. If we want to be critical about transport and mobility, and this involves reflecting on its role in this particular mode of economic production, which is called capitalism. I mean, I'm not obsessed with capitalism, but it exists and we live in it. If we lived in something else, then we will probably discuss the role of transport and mobility in that. So I think that what's absolutely crucial is understanding how transport and mobility reproduces different inequalities that are related to this economic system. And I mean, mobility is a form of capital in capitalism. So the way that we move and the different inequalities related to our gender, to our race, to our age, to our body, and its different capacities or lack thereof, this very much defines our capacity to be an active member of this capitalist society. And as long as there is no policy that overcomes this or addresses this, well, our mobility experience is extremely defined by this. And I mean, one example is, of course, we know this very well, the way that women, on average, in the global north, in capitalist societies, the way that women move is very different from the way that men move. In a way that relates to their care-related responsibilities, their mobility is much more complicated. It involves much more trips on a daily basis that are shorter usually, that are much more irregular. Destinations, times, modes vary more than what is still the backbone of a transport modeling, which is the work-to-home commute or home-to-work commute of a white male in middle class wearing a suit probably and having this little 1970s leather whatever suitcase or whatever that is. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but still when you look at how modeling is done, it's still very much looking at this origin to destination models that are very much masculine based, if not machista, I think I'm thinking of even. So I think there is a question of inequalities here. And the second one is, if I'm still addressing your question, if I understood it correctly, I think the question is that we need to ask ourselves, are we interested in changing the mobility situation within the current paradigm? So for example, facilitating a shift from one mode to another, let's say from the car to public transport within capitalism? Or are we interested in transport and mobility opening possibilities for a different way of living? Where, for example, mobility is not a guarantee for having a fruitful, wholesome life as it is today. I mean, the idea is not necessarily to increase the capacity of everybody to move. And we see this being done in many, especially in large urban agglomerations, where investment in the public transport facilities, infrastructure, for example, in London or many, well, there's not many similarly sized cities, but other large cities in Europe, basically in the capitalist system induces very often gentrification. It pushes commuters even farther away where housing prices are more attractive. And I'm not saying that investment in public transport is a bad thing, but suddenly we see that it's a double-edged sword. It's a situation in which we basically, within the current system, shifted things around a little bit, but we haven't really changed much at all. So I think addressing these inequalities and realizing that we are moving within a system that is very, the capacity for it to really create alternatives in terms of mobility is very limited. And that at the same time, transport mobility, well, I mentioned this, I think, earlier, it is a backbone of a capitalist system. Without transport and mobility, capitalism would not be able to exist because goods would not flow and workers would not be able to go for where they work. This, of course, is changing a little bit with online work and all that, but still, let's not be kidding ourselves. This is a very small group of people who can perform this kind of work. And I think this also relates there's a lot of things there, right? But there's this question of the right to mobility, for example, which a lot of social movements are raising and saying that we all should have the right to be mobile. This is a very common cause or common slogan in the US, especially, where we're dealing with these public transport deserts, food deserts. So whole communities that are excluded from any alternative form of transit or transport other than the car. But we see, and I think the pandemic showed it very clearly, that actually a parallel right that we should also be thinking of is the right to immobility, because the pandemic actually allowed a very small, narrow, elite group of people not to be mobile. They really didn't have to engage in transmobility, and their life hasn't changed a bit. They even got better. I mean, their stock went up, and they could go to their third or fourth house on a beach or wherever they like to spend their time. And they didn't care where their food come from or who prepared it. They didn't have to go out there and share spaces in public transport with others, which temporarily got actually very, very dangerous in some contexts at least. So I think there is that's at least some thoughts that I have on the relationship between mobility and capitalism. So I would say that indeed, we also from the environmental perspective, we should really strive to overall, and I think that's pretty clear, reduce the overall mobility levels globally. We really see that transport is, as I showed, a very important contributor to the CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions. But this reduction cannot be done within capitalism, because if it was done within capitalism, then of course it would add and exacerbate probably to the inequalities. So the question is who should be moving less and not. Yeah, I think this is very important. Indeed, I agree. I'm not sure I understood the question or don't know how to respond, but I fully agree with this idea that a lot of innovations that we see today in transport, they hide the question of costs. The geography of cost, for example, is completely hidden in the case of electric cars. I mean, you don't care with the battery, well, not only where the battery is made, that in of itself can be a very polluting activity, as we see in the case of Berlin's Tesla facility that is now being heavily protested with the use of water that it has on the local environment, but of course where the lithium comes from and what kind of local but also geopolitical tensions it produces in Bolivia and Kyrgyzstan and China. That is not what Tesla, Volkswagen, or any of Volvo probably as well, all other producers that sell electric vehicles want us to think of. This is supposedly a neutral, progressive, very forward-thinking way of moving around. And the moment you start digging, of course, there are a lot of not only environmental and social externalities, but geopolitical ones too. So I am not a cultural geographer. I'm not a cultural studies person. So I enjoy very much all the cultural artifacts that involve cars and other modes of transport, public transport especially. So I could probably do a course just using those, but I don't know how to analyze them. I have not really done that a lot, so I will not respond to that.
Thank you. Do you have a question? Okay, so I see 3 hands. Maybe we start with just close.
Okay, there's more questions, so we'll keep it very short. You mentioned that we have now a neoclassical understanding of transportation, a sustainable development understanding of it. Yeah, can you put a name to what you see coming or would wish to come if there is such a thing as a new understanding then? And yeah, I'll just keep it that simple for now.
You mean like a new field emerging or like a new...
Yeah, or a new understanding that you see would be better if we're talking a eco-modernist or a degrowth or I don't know, whatever you want to describe this as.
Yeah. I think there are should we take another question then? Maybe.
Okay, sorry.
I will not forget. No worries there.
I'm just wondering if there is a correlation between transport demand and ecological services, because when people moved away from villages and industrialization took place, I mean, there was a lot of importation of services which were localized in the local communities. Right now, people cannot produce quite a lot of food locally.
Yeah.
And I tend to think that there might be a correlation between that kind of ecological service, because we are importing almost everything from outside or from somewhere, and instead of producing it locally. I tend to think that that also increases transport or vehicles on the road, but I don't know.
So you mean like the process of urbanization, whether it translates to increased transport demand, because there is specialization of the distribution of functions and all that. Yeah. Okay. Maybe I'll respond immediately to this and to the previous question, just not to make things complicated. If I understand your question well, the second one, I think so, but I don't think that what we also need to. Well, yeah, I think so, and I don't think that there is a question that there is any aspiration. Perhaps in some quarters, yes, but I don't think this is a very serious claim to go back to this pre-urban, pre-modern version of humanity. And that actually neatly relates to the question of degrowth as well. I myself have been influenced by degrowth, following a lot this movement or this strand of scholarly work, because by now it's produced quite a substantial amount of academic work as well. And I think in part of the degrowth movement, for example, advocates for abandoning cities entirely, arguing that it's completely unsustainable, that the amount of materials that will be, in terms of energy especially, this is completely impossible to sustain. But then there are also those who say that we really need to increase the density of our communities, and we actually need to seriously rethink indeed how we manage the specialization of different functions. Food production is being one, to reduce mobility on which we depend, for example, for logistics. Indeed, you're absolutely right. Of course, the food and many other things that we consume very often now come from extremely far away locations. I don't remember the data now. There is, I have these slides as part of my other one of my courses. Indeed, the amount of miles or kilometers traversed by different products that an average human consumes these days has really skyrocketed in the past years or decades. So we really depend on networks that are extremely global, and for the dependency between mobility and capitalism to stop, and for this extremely toxic influence that mobility and transport have on the global environment also to end, we really need to rethink this. But I'm not sure where, but this is not, I'm now going a little bit outside of my area of expertise. I'm not aware of anybody really proposing a viable, variable formula for sustaining, for example, urban development or not so urban development in the future. What kind of communities we need to design to make that possible. As I said, this relates to the earlier question about some kind of alternative concepts or alternative visions. I think that degrowth, for example, is a very interesting strand of thinking, of research, of activism as well. I think for now, it's not really engaged so much with transport mobility. I did something in that direction, published 2 papers on that with some colleagues as well. And there is a little group of degrowers who are thinking about transport and mobility. I think that what emerges there is a very strong recognition, not only that is not only specific of degrowth, that any solution to the current social, environmental, political problems, you name it, has to be a collective solution. So that we really have to move beyond this idea that it's about nudging consumers to make proper individual choices, to buy a better car or not to buy a car, to cycle, to walk, to live in a place that we consider to be good these days. Whereas 50 years ago, we as a state, Swedish or Belgian or Polish, considered suburbs to be a perfect place for people to live. I mean, I think the moment you individualize these problems, it's very difficult to actually achieve a strategic structural change, but also it's very difficult to convince people that, well, now you are right and you were wrong 50 years ago. I mean, it can also generate a lot of anger, discontent, which I think is in many ways quite rightly formulated and quite rightly articulated. I do understand why the working class, at least on the transport and mobility front, really follows the far right with its extremely simple recipes, and why it does not vote the Greens. Maybe in Sweden this is not the case, but as far as I know, in most Western European countries, Greens is a very middle-class party, and it fails to convince the working class. I think it's for a reason. So I think degrowth is interesting. Tomorrow I'll be talking about free public transport as a policy that I think could be an alternative. It's not this kind of alternative yet, but I think there are signs of practices and policies which could be, which could form part of some kind of socio-ecological transition, of a very radical transition, where we not only tell people, don't do this, don't drive, don't live in the suburbs, don't smoke, and don't eat meat, which is probably what should happen. I mean, we should not be doing these things, but there are also some positive steps that we could take, that we could engage in a number of activities that are, I think, or have to be essentially collective. These are not individual choices. Very nice to have you. I don't know if I've well understood and answered your question, but I've tried.
Great.
Thanks. Let's move on then to the next one.
And then we collect a couple of questions.
Great.
Questions online.
Ah, yeah, great. Thanks for taking care of that.
Thank you very much for
Thank you.
fascinating talk, and there was so much going on in this field. So I just want to try to formulate a comment that came to me as the discussion was flowing, which is about this discussion about capitalism and the role of markets and economics and so on. And you started your talk with pictures of socialist countries and their big highways were morphologically very similar to things that you can observe in the Western capitalist world. So I was wondering, in the part of your talk where you try to deconstruct sustainable mobility, perhaps that would there would be something to do about reflecting about the use of the economics metaphor in the talk and the role of assigned to capitalism, because it seems to me that perhaps it's only an economic metaphor that is used by these people in the transportation engineering that is used as an equivalent of technical rationality, perhaps simply. And yes, a bit because you know, if we think of biking or bikeable cities, they are very much located into very capitalist countries. So it seems to me that so
it's not
probably a possibility to go further.
You mean within capitalism, or
to perhaps remove the capitalist
critique
enemy.
Yeah.
And think beyond that or beyond the economic metaphor.
Sure.
What is the economic metaphor making?
Well, you should have seen me 10 years ago when I was. This is a very light version of the critique.
Can we maybe collect?
Yeah, sure.
Also,
I'll try not to.
I'll try whether this works. Linus, you are allowed to talk now. Can you ask?
Yes.
Or yeah.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Well.
So thank you for the lectures. Really interesting. I'm wondering if you have any insight or thoughts on how cities who are looking to do experiments with different transportation solutions navigate this tension between the neoclassical way of thinking about transportation and this kind of alternative, sustainable way of managing it. And I kind of ask this question because if they are going to try and implement truly novel and sustainable transportation solutions, they're challenged right from the start because all of the institutions and the other different actors have this kind of neoclassical logic embedded in their sort of structures and ways of thinking. So this kind of deselects right from the beginning, perhaps, the really novel ways that cities could change transportation. This is just a thought.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. And may I ask now also, Maria Caballero has also a question. Maria, do you want to ask directly? Wait, sorry. Ask to unmute. So it still looks. So Maria, are you not able to talk? I think so. I'll read the question. So Maria says also great presentation, continuing on the relationship between capitalism and mobility, which we were discussing before. I was wondering about the potential of shared mobility as one way to start breaking the idea of ownership of the capitalist system, and also pushing towards an urban planning that puts into the center the idea of community. Is this a topic that is currently being researched?
Great. Shall I start asking? I'll start with this last question because I just have slides that I didn't show that relate to this specific. Thank you for all the questions. They're really brilliant, really inspiring, and going beyond the talk. I really appreciate it. I think that indeed the question of shared mobility, it's something that, well, probably it's a very old way of practicing mobility in transport that we all know. I mean, the idea of having a bicycle in your neighborhood and giving it to your neighbor or giving it to your friend when they need it is really not something that Elon Musk or what's the CEO's name of Uber came up with. I mean, this is really something that is very embedded in our social nature, so to speak, like in very inverted commas. So I think that indeed some kind of vision of urban or just mobility in transport, whether urban or not, that I personally have is, as I mentioned in relation to one of the previous questions, it all has to hinge on collective solutions. So it has to hinge on essentially sharing, or practices of sharing. The problem that I have is that the moment you involve corporate actors in this, is that I'm really not obsessed with Elon Musk and all others. If they want to innovate or claim that they innovate, fair enough, go for it. The problem is that I think the fundamental difference between the private and the public actor is that the private actor will always strive for the benefit and profit of the shareholders. So, and this is perfectly okay within this logic of the economic system which we live in. Any company has to produce profit, has to produce benefit, and that's fine. The problem is that public transport companies or public companies as such, they really do not follow this logic. Their logic is very different. Their focus should be at least on the benefit and well-being of all across the territory, across society. And if you can marry this to an extent where through procurement practices, for example, in public transport or shared mobility, fine. But I really don't think that this can be done in the long term in the whole territory. Quite simply, and we see this, for example, with shared bicycle system. For a while, I lived in Madrid, the capital of Spain. The geography of the shared bicycle system there is extremely divisive. Basically, working class communities are not covered. So, I mean, this is maybe an extreme case, I don't know. I think that for a while, this was also the case in Brussels. Maybe not with the shared bicycle system, but you clearly see this with these e-scooters and different companies when they enter the city. Of course, whether they start, they always start in middle-class areas around the European Parliament and different institutions. Then maybe eventually they expand to the working-class area of the city. And why? I mean, we can criticize them, but I also understand the way of operating. They want to make money. So I think shared mobility, yes, but I'm not sure that the corporate element really is the way forward. To go to the question about the link between capitalism and mobility, as I said, you should have seen me 10 years ago. I was much more radical, perhaps. Now I'm a middle-aged man and still white and still middle. Well, now I'm middle class. When I was a student, I wasn't. So maybe I've calmed down a little bit. But well, all jokes aside, I think that. I mean, we live in a very capitalist. Very capitalist. We live in a capitalist system. So I think it's, as a critical scholar, I feel that it's important for me to analyze what role this economic system, these economic dynamics, institutions have, and how do they interact with the object of my work, which is transport and mobility. I think if I don't do this, then I think I run the risk of really misunderstanding quite a lot of what's going on. So that's like first point there. Indeed, a lot of the dynamics that we see in capitalist cities or capitalist contexts have also emerged in socialist or state socialist ones, like for example, this through a neoclassical infrastructure. The degrowers would say that the problem is not capitalism or socialism, the problem is growth. And the idea that to produce growth or sustain growth in the particular field of transport and mobility, both systems kind of fell into the same trap of promoting automobility as a very kind of modern, progressive, speed-oriented mode of travel, and they produced infrastructure to accommodate this mode. With a big disclaimer that in state socialism, the levels of individual consumption of mobility never reached those similar to the capitalist countries. But I mean, there is a discussion why that was the case. I'm not sure that ejecting capitalism from the analysis really serves us a lot. I was a little bit triggered by your last comment about the cyclable or cycling-friendly cities being located mostly in capitalist contexts, which might be true to an extent, but I think that actually is quite a strong sign of, on the one hand, a very strong promotion that these cities have. So the fact that Copenhagen and Amsterdam, for example, are considered to be cyclable and are promoting of cycling, on the one hand, of course, relates to the practice on the ground. So they are indeed very cyclable cities. But the fact that, for example, there's a lot of cycling practices in the global south, in African cities, for example, Latin American cities, and this is virtually unknown. And, well, very few people would think of getting inspiring by Havana or some other Cuban cities, does not relate to the reality on the ground. It relates to the politics of knowledge production and transfer or mobility. It's not a coincidence that it's Copenhagen, Amsterdam, Barcelona, and other Western European cities that organize conferences, they organize circuits to which they invite experts from different countries, cities around the world to promote their success stories. There was an excellent paper by Sara Gonzalez, I think she used to be, I don't know if she still is, based at the University of Leeds, who wrote about how this works specifically for Barcelona. And she discovered that Barcelona essentially has two narratives, one for the European cities and one for Latin American cities, which are essentially contradictory, or to a large extent. So it's selling two narratives, one for the Latin American customer and one for the Western European customer, as both successes. So Latin American, so I think the Western European ones would learn a lot about the Olympics. The Latin American ones, well, that's maybe Olympics is too much of a stake for them, so let's teach them about something else. Which, I mean, for me, this is extremely colonial. This is really, it's forgetting about, or I think purposely not seeing in our field a very rich diversity of experiences and success stories coming from the global South and East. So, for example, Cuba as a country where if you walk around these cities on the island, they are extremely walkable, extremely cyclable, very little space is given to the car. But of course, for a lot of geopolitical, for a lot of or political reasons, this is not the place where we are learning anything from. This is supposedly a place of crisis, decline, etc., etc. But of course, and maybe that's the last note before I go to the previous question. Well, capitalism, of course, is also a place where a lot of innovations can be made. I mean, yes. So that also has to be acknowledged. Absolutely. Going to the question by Linus, thank you very much. Perhaps one thing that I want to highlight in my response, I don't know if I can cover the whole question, is that indeed, if we go deep at the roots of the problem, we realize that indeed there's a whole question of how knowledge is produced about transport and mobility, and what kind of institutions produce the experts with whom we work, or who then enter into the institutions on the municipal, regional, or whatever level. And indeed, this is, I think, quite an issue. We can be a very progressive, for example, policymaker. We can see, and this is, for example, the case of Barcelona and Madrid with the so-called cities of change, Ciudades de Cambio, where the progressive movements entered the municipality, I think, in the late 2010s, if I'm not mistaken, with a very progressive agenda. But what they found was technical workers, I'm not saying engineers or economists, but basically workers who know about public administration, who, well, they were not as radical as the movements that entered the office. So suddenly you need to work with, I think this was particularly the case with housing, but I think transport also to an extent. Suddenly the main planner, the main person who knows the technicalities of the system does not share the radical vision that you have. And their education is indeed from some kind of polytechnic university. And I mean, they do believe in modeling. They still want to do a model. So you cannot just, throw the table upside down and claim that now we're going to do everything differently. Or at least this is quite limited and difficult. I think, I don't know, right off the cuff, I don't know of any cities that have dealt with it in any way. I can only share the story of my own, Brussels, where I think this is particularly difficult. Because where, as I mentioned, we have this split within the public transport company, for example, between people who are responsible for the underground infrastructure and the surface infrastructure. So whenever you throw a question at them in terms of what should be done with public transport, there is a very strong push for coming up with a new metro line. And we have a plan of metro lines dating back to the 1970s. And we really see every time this question is asked, the plans go up to the surface and we are shown a new metro line, which looks suspiciously the same as the plan from the 1973 or 74. And we really have not really moved on from then. So it really is a very fundamental question of how do we change also the way that transport is taught. And I mean, this is maybe a good place to think about that because we are in the university. So we really are responsible for the next generation of transport thinkers. Maybe we can do something good in the world.
Okay, I think we went a bit over time, so we can just finish here. Thank you again, and thank you everyone for your comments and questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.